So before I get started, and I definitely want to leave some time for questions, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about my background. So I actually got my PhD here in 2010, which I realized is 16 years. It'll be 16 years this May. And I've been at Loyola for now 12 years. I started at Stifling University, which is also in Maryland, right after graduating here. And I spent the year at Johns Hopkins, which is like a really cool place, and it's been fun to think about my research. Before I came back to graduate school, I had a background in political polling and strategic communication, and I worked for a bunch of Democratic candidates who you probably don't recognize, but at one point had either great promise and lost in a big way, or kind of had to resign because of scandal. So I have a bad track record of who I picked. But it was actually really helpful because when I was here at Wisconsin, I was a project assistant at the UW Survey Center and got to apply what I was doing in the real world to academic studies. And I was also a member of the SciMap research group. So a lot of stuff kind of culminated here. So I actually do research across 3 areas. I'm going to focus on political comedy and entertainment today, and I'll kind of explain why. But I also do a lot of work in public opinion and also public engagement with science. And that public engagement with science work is what I've actually done with a lot of my fellow UW-Madison alum colleagues. And my work is across methods. So I do experiments and surveys, but I've also done a bit more qualitative work recently in textual analysis. So I'm both a kind of social scientist and a little bit of a humanities person kind of thrown in there. And what is really guiding my work is a series of core research questions. In the area of political comedy and entertainment, can entertainment media impact knowledge, engagement, and issue advocacy? In the area of public opinion, what narratives can shape opinion to advance a more tolerant public sphere? And in science, public engagement with science, how can we use humor to make science more accessible and engaging for the public? So it's kind of all connected. I was trained as a public opinion researcher here, and I've actually looked at a lot of different controversial political and science topics over the years. I've done a lot of work on same-sex marriage and LGBT rights, but also things like foreign policy, climate change, emerging technology, rising anti-Semitism, political consumerism, all these kinds of things. But people always ask me about my humor work. And this is a slide that I prepared for, to introduce myself to the group of Hopkins Fellows, because it all kind of comes back to comedy for me. And I realize it's such a big part of my life. So it's in my Halloween costumes. So in 2018, I was the midterms. Those are Scantrons and Blue Books. I know we don't use those anymore. That is not Bernie Sanders, that's me. But it was very convincing. I showed up at a neighbor's house, and I was who's the old man who came for Halloween? And I was hi, it's me. I got to go, so my undergraduate is from Brown University, and so comedy has also led me in these places. So I got to go back and teach a class at my undergraduate university, which is always kind of cool when you teach in the class that you were a student at. I also got to have a conversation this summer with Jordan Klepper about comedy. If you might know him from not Monday nights on The Daily Show. And it's really been guiding my sabbatical. That's my family. They come to, we do election day stuff at Loyola. They all come along. I still hold up. So you should always do a first day of school photo for your family, even when you're here. That's a first day of sabbatical photo. And I actually got to start sabbatical by going on a trip through Spain and Italy, following the path of Ignatius Loyola. It's a long story. But there were researchers from all different schools, and everyone kept asking me about my work because everyone wanted to talk about comedy. So I figured I would talk about comedy with you guys today. And so it all kind of started with this conference that actually, where I met Mike for the first time and we talked about a project. In 2007, which is ages ago, there was this debate about Jon Stewart, who was the host of The Daily Show at the time. Was he a sinner or saint in the Church of Democracy? That's what they were asking. And it doesn't make a lot of sense if you know anything about Jon Stewart's background, right? He probably wouldn't be in a church anyway. But it was this idea of was all this political satire and stuff a good thing, or was it really hurting democracy? And if you fast forward from 2007, we generally think that political comedy is a net positive for democracy. So it increases political knowledge, It shapes people's attitudes and opinions. It makes people feel better about their own ability to understand and participate in the political process, political efficacy. It gets them to do things and to participate. It doesn't shape voter turnout, but it does get them to comment on a petition or to engage on an issue. And it also shapes our media environment. And that's something I've been looking at more broadly. Like, even if you don't watch late night comedy on television, because all my undergraduates tell me, like, I don't watch television, which is fair. This is the stuff that people are talking about, and it's like shaping other media narratives. It's also getting recirculated in smaller forms, like on TikTok. So overall, I think it's a net positive. And I can give you some examples of things that I found before I get to like what I've been focusing on this year about like how do we get it to be a positive agent for democracy. So I'll share a little bit from an experiment with you, and then I have like a qualitative piece, and then we'll talk about what I think comedy needs to do to really continue to help democracy. So one of the things that was really interesting, so I had 2 kids at home during COVID doing school in my basement. It was terrible. Anyone go to online school in their basement? Awful, right? So my son goes back to the physical school building in 1st grade, and one of the first things he learns on one of the first days back was that if there's an active shooter and he's in the bathroom, he's supposed to close the door and stand on the toilet. And I was like, oh, we weren't thinking about that when you were home in the basement. Like, I still would rather you be in the school building, but this is like a reality of what it is going to school, right? And this issue's been a big deal for late night comedy, in part, and I'll show you what I mean, because we've had a lack of leadership from our politicians, right? And so who can we look to talk about this issue? And what I wanted to understand is what happens when a political comedian breaks what we call the 4th wall and doesn't tell jokes, but talks to the audience like a regular person. And in this case, I was looking at Jimmy Kimmel's advocacy from the Uvalde, Texas school shooting, which happened in 2022. I thought that, we're not seeing any change on this issue, but what happens if we look to comedians to help us deal with this issue of gun violence? And so what happens when comedians break the 4th wall and get personal to share about an issue like gun control? And what I thought would happen, and when I see through a course of an experiment, is that, number one, people engage more with the host. When political comedy hosts tell you who they are and what they care about, you identify with them more, you engage with them in what's called parasocial interaction. You feel kind of like they're a friend, right? And you can get transported or be more engaged with their message. And you're also more likely to take what they're saying, and you're less likely to discount it and throw it away. You're more likely to connect it to other things that you know, and you're more likely to find it informative. Those are kind of the big findings that I ultimately found. And what I did to get there was I did an experiment where some people watched just a regular monologue from May 24th, which was the day before the shooting. Some people watched his monologue on May 25th where there was no studio audience. He talked directly to the camera, talked about gun control. And then some people watched that monologue, plus he aired like a 2-minute clip from, it was created by Everytown for gun safety with all these clips about the issue. And so I know some of you guys are statistics folks, some of you are not, but I was really looking at kind of identification with the host and then also message engagement. And I ran a series of regressions, and I think the most interesting, and I do want to be brief so we can talk about democracy, but the idea is that people who don't watch late night comedy that regularly and are less likely to prefer, say, entertaining news to straight news, actually engaged more with Kimmel when he was talking about the issue and taking a step back and talking directly to the people, on the television screen rather than telling jokes. And so he's forging a connection with people who are not normally tuning into this stuff and not normally seeking out this kind of stuff. And so it made me think that maybe these non-traditional media actors are better spokespeople or people for us to engage with on some of these issues where we don't see much movement than, say, politicians or traditional journalists reporting the news. And the other thing that was interesting is that the effects of the message were also greater for those who don't watch comedy that often and don't really prefer entertaining news. And so to me, it seems like he's able to bring more people into the issue discussion by being personal about what he thinks. And so, there are various tables and graphs, but you can see basically the idea is that people who watched him talk about Uvalde, there was a bigger gap in things like, they were less likely to discount the message, they were more likely to find it to be informative, and they were more likely to connect it with other things they knew than people who just watched regular comedy. And this was particularly pronounced among people who don't normally watch comedy. So I thought, oh, maybe personalized political comedy can not only encourage greater psychological engagement with the host, like we like this guy, he's our friend, but it can also get us to think more seriously about the messaging and the messaging around gun control, hopefully maybe broadening the issue public for key debates. So that's kind of one way that I've seen political comedy, at least like experimentally enhance democracy, right? It gets more people talking, gets more people engaged and more connected. Another way to look at this is more of like a qualitative piece, that I wanted to understand what happens when a political comedian asks us to do something. So usually a call to action comes from a respected spokesperson, someone from a political party, a nonprofit organization. It can kind of come from clergy, even though it's not always like supposed to, right? But what does it mean when we get a call to do something from a comedian, right? And so what is it? A call to action generally taps into like our resources, our time, our money, our civic skills, our comfort with political engagement, and we are supposed to like make a little bit of a change. And so what I did is I looked at John Oliver's show over time. He usually tackles a new issue, right? And he is like, so last week I think it was it like all the Homeland Security stuff? There's been a few different like hot button issues. Like each show is a new issue. But during COVID, he actually talked about a lot of different things related to COVID. And part of what he was doing in addressing the issue and kind of calling people to action is he was actually asking them to give money. And so what does it mean when a comedian or a media personality actually asks us to like donate money and do something? And so I engaged in something called thematic textual analysis. Basically, I watched all 55 episodes from season 7 and 8 that aired during COVID. I had a lot of time stuck at home, so I watched a lot of TV. I also looked at any of the YouTube like straight to web content that the show had aired, and I also looked at all of the circulating press coverage that was talking about what he was doing on the show. Like one of the things that's important about political comedy, again, especially if young people aren't watching television, it's the way it gets talked about and circulated in the media. Like, I don't know if any of you guys still watch Saturday Night Live, but people then talk about the skits like throughout the week and it gets reported on mainstream media. It was always the same thing with political ads. It never really mattered if you saw the ad on television, but it was like all the rehashing of it that ended up having an impact. So anyway, I wanted to understand what was like going on with all these call to actions, and I found that there were 3 ways that Oliver did this. 1, he asked individual viewers to do something. 2, he kind of engaged with corporations, and I'll show you an example. And 3, he gave on behalf of the shows, like he used the production budget to give to organizations that he cared about. And so for individuals, he would ask you to give like $15, and it tended to go to the food banks. You could buy stamps for the US Postal Service. It supported their retirement fund, because remember, everyone was ordering everything online and getting stuff in the mail during COVID, right? And these like first responders or frontline folks were working harder. You could buy a bear, and that would help what was going on in Belarus. You could actually buy like a package of Band-Aids for $15, and that went to this like fake health ministry that he created that paid down people's medical debt. So people were doing this. Like fans of the shows would send in $15, they'd get a little thing, and it would raise all this money, and for like a day or two, this would be the circulating story on social media. And it created this kind of like fan community, because it was really like easy to do these, like to click a thing online and give him $15, but you were end up like being involved in a cause that he thought was important. He also engaged with corporations online, so on Twitter. So I never really thought about this, but apparently on the Pringles can is just like the head, right? And so he wanted to know what the Pringles guide looked like from the waist down, and so he did this whole campaign with them, and people sent in like all sorts of pictures that are not appropriate to share. But in the end, he got Pringles to give $20,000 to Feeding America. And he also engaged with Cheerios, trying to get them to like drop an F-bomb on Twitter, which they wouldn't do because they're a family brand. They ended up contributing $100,000 to Feeding America. right? And so then on behalf of the show, he raised money for different, 5 different food banks in different cities by having a traveling art exhibit that went to a bunch of different museums. Because if you remember, during COVID, people also weren't supporting the arts and going to museums, right? And so it came to one of the museums in Baltimore, where I live. It was 3 pieces of art. I went to see it, and I gave the museum like $15. So therefore I was helping the museum, and he then donated to the food banks in all of those cities as well. He gets a sewage plant named after him in Danbury, Connecticut, and he, along the way, gives $55,000 to teachers and other GoFundMe kind of stuff in Danbury, Connecticut. So all of to say that during the course of COVID, he was using the show as a platform kind of to raise money, right? And so all told, he raises over $5 million for both domestic and international causes. Some is from individual contributions, some is from the show, some is from corporations. And fans get something in return, right? They feel like they're part of a community, they engage on social media, and they get a thing, like a bear or stamps or whatever. And we see this political community form because he's asked people to do this small thing. But what does it mean for our democracy when we get our cues about which organizations we should support financially from a political comedian, right? It's definitely one political perspective. And one of the things, I presented this at a conference, and they said, well, what happens if news personalities start doing this? And not just someone from PBS, but Fox News, right, or MSNBC. What does it mean when we're taking our cues about where to give our money from media personalities, right? So it's something to think about, how is this impacting democracy? And so I've actually done a lot of different political comedy projects over the years, everything from looking at how Joe Biden was portrayed in The Onion, to interviews with Andrew Cuomo and COVID, to stuff on gender, to the Strike Force 5 podcast, which is hilarious, by the way, and was created when these comedians created it when there was the writer's strike and their show couldn't broadcast to support their cast. We happen to live in this era of political comedy where people, the hosts are not fighting each other for ratings, but kind of getting along. And that's, I think, a strength for democracy, which I'll get to. I've looked at Ted Lasso because the cast went to talk about mental health at the White House and what kind of impact did that have on issue engagement. I've looked at Borat, I've looked at Mandy Patinkin on Twitter, all sorts of fun stuff. And so I got to this point where it was time for sabbatical, and I was I need to make sense of all of this. What is, because people would always ask me, they would go back to that Jon Stewart question of is this good for democracy? Is it bad? And I kind of thought well, I think we settled that it's generally a net positive for democracy, but how does that really work in this era of there's only certain people or types of people who are watching John Oliver and giving him money, right? It tends to be preaching to the choir. And so in this era of partisan, divides and people only watching media that kind of agrees with them, is it still saving our democracy or is it stifling it? And so first I had to take a look at the state of political comedy and satire today. If anyone has seen any of the last 2 seasons of South Park, that's where we're getting the most extreme content, in part because they had already signed a renewal contract with Paramount and not subject to some of this financial pressures, whatever. So this is kind of where political comedy is in some ways, right? And as a text, so qualitatively, political comedy is more political. All of the network shows Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, they're all talking more about politics than just talking about entertainment compared to where they were a few years ago, right? Political comedy is on television, yes, the thing that nobody watches, but it's also on TikTok, right? And so we're seeing format changes. And it's also more judgmental. So there's a difference between judgmental and aggressive satire versus playful and kind of laughter-inducing satire. And comedy has become more judgmental and critical, right? In terms of effects, we know that it's both defining our social identity. So people identify themselves as being a Daily Show viewer is part of who I am, right? As a person existing in this world. But it's also kind of reinforcing echo chambers in a lot of ways because it's only the same people who are watching stuff that they agree with. People are having more parasocial engagement and emotional connections with hosts. It's the whole Jimmy Kimmel thing when he stops and talks about gun violence. talks to you like as a father of 2 kids, right? And people like kind of identify with him and form these parasocial relationships. And then we also have comedy asking us to do stuff and kind of engage digitally, and that's John Oliver's call to action. So we're starting to see like these effects that kind of surround kind of who we think we are, right? And so, but how do we figure that out, and what is political comedy doing given our current media environment, where we have young people aren't watching TV, right? We have people getting canceled, right? So Stephen Colbert, right? The whole Jimmy Kimmel back and forth thing, right? We have people selectively exposing themselves to content that they agree with, but not looking at, like everyone always says, oh, do you look at Greg Gutfeld? And I was like, no, I haven't done research on that yet. But there is technically comedy on the other side, right? We have short attention spans. We are not really watching John Oliver when he talks about an issue for 25 minutes, but we're seeing the little clip, right? And we are driven in getting our information from influencers, not experts, right? So that's like the circulating media environment that we're in. And these are late night comics. Like, what's wrong with this picture, right? Like 5 white men in their 50s to 60s who could be like somebody's dad, right? I mean, like where's the future, right? And that's like a real concern, because is this like a dying medium if Colbert goes off the air? So Jimmy Kimmel is back, but he was like, he's been on the air for 23 years, like ready to retire before all this stuff. And like, if this is the state of political comedy, and I always show this in my classes, and that everyone like, it was like, oh my God, you know, like they're really, but like when you look at them side by side, like it's quite a contrast. So given all this media environment, my goal this year was to set out and figure out how can political comedy save democracy? So how, and this is an AI image that they used for my talk at Hopkins, but I was like, okay, I'll take it. So like basically the question is, how can we go from this, right? This is what people think our politics is, and it's actually not as bad as this, right? There's the misperception that, you know, that this is what things are like, and in some places it is what things are like. But how can we go from this, or the perception that this is where we are, to something a little bit more like this? And so in my research, I proposed a few things that I think will help comedy continue to save democracy rather than further separate us into echo chambers. And so some of the things I've been proposing this year, one is bridge polarized divides through conversation. So I don't know if anyone has actually watched Jordan Klepper's like Finger the Pulse special stuff. It kind of reminds me of when Stephen Colbert was on the Colbert Report and would go out and interview people and kind of be like making fun of them in the process. But one of the things that Jordan Klepper has done, he has a TED Talk where he talks about people need to have conversations, right? And they need to be willing to say, I don't know anything about this, or listen to people who disagree with them. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is get people talking. And like, I know that comedy doesn't necessarily do that, but when you do think about an issue like gun control, like they're actually, I know there's people on both sides of the gun right issues, but everyone wants their kids safe at school, right? And so if we can bring people together in conversation, maybe we can bridge some of those divides. One of the other things that comedy needs to do and continue to do, and where they've done quite well, is to give voice to the powerless. So political comedy hosts have taken on issues that they care about, like we saw with John Oliver with some of the fundraising, and actually still provide this voice and spotlight issues that are not really being talked about in the media. And so the most famous example, and it still like resonates with me, is when Jon Stewart worked to make sure that the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund, which was originally, so you guys, it used to be that 9/11 was the thing that my students, like their first political memory, and now everyone, my undergraduates are all born like well after it. But it was this idea that, so first there was funding for people who had lost a family member or had suffered like as the effects of 9/11. And then we found that so many of the first responders had really serious health consequences from being down there without proper protective gear. And so Jon Stewart got really involved in the fight to reauthorize this bill and to continue to fund health care for first responders. And he would have to like go to Congress and talk to them and lobby. And the bill at first would get passed like every couple of years, right? So it would get extended like 2020, 2024. It's now been extended through 2090. And that's in part because of his advocacy. And I lived in New York on 9/11. Like, it was right after college for me. Like, it's one of the most shameful things I think this country's ever done is to not take care of, like, veterans and first responders and things like that. And so he really has brought this issue to the forefront. Other comedians have picked other issues that they've championed. Jon Stewart's also got involved with burn pits and veterans and stuff, so has like continued on this advocacy. But I think that we still rely on political comedy to give voice to the powerless and to talk about things that we are not seeing in our mainstream media. It also needs to continue to bring people together through laughter. So this podcast is really fun. It's like some of the episodes are so hilarious, like even if you're like the most serious person who doesn't like humor. And one of the things that's great about the political comedy environment that we're in is that these guys are not fighting against each other for ratings, right? They're working together. And so one of the things, like if comedy makes you laugh first, there's all this research about people seek out comedy for the entertainment, not for the information or the politics, but then they learn something as a result, right? And so if it can continue to make us laugh, I think it will help to continue to save democracy. It needs to hold the media accountable through satire. And while political comedy has been really harsh to politicians, it's also been harsh on the media. People don't know what information to trust anymore, right? And so we need comedy to keep the media accountable, particularly in this era of like consolidation and partisanship. And I think that's one of the ways that I found that it's going to start to help save democracy. Airtime for new formats and new displays of personal authenticity. So Jimmy Fallon is the least political of all those like 5 white guys that I showed you, right? His show is much more about entertainment, but he's had great success digitally compared to everybody else because he's embracing TikTok and, you know, doing more like skit and short-based things. And so I think comedy needs to recognize, and some shows are doing this better than others, that it's not just about television, right? It's about getting the content out in whatever form people are consuming. So I think that we need to see this shift away. We need to continue with legacy TV, but this shift away towards formats, and also people want to like comedians who they identify with, right? All that parasocial interaction stuff, so we need to see that as well. And the last thing that I've started to see is that gives viewers something to do, right? This John Oliver stuff has like been pretty successful in raising all this money. People are seeking out this content because they want like almost like comic relief in this weird political time. So giving something people to do, I think, is one of the ways that we can save democracy. And so it raises all this question about, is TV dead? And this is a favorite like anecdote that I like to share with folks. So when Jon Stewart goes back, he starts hosting every Monday night in February of 2024, and he's now going to do it at least through another year. He's not on that list of like 5 comedians, but he's even older, right, and grayer than those guys. And so, you know, people said, well, why are you like going back to TV? Like nobody's watching it, right? And it's this whole idea that like, is TV dead? But they're still creating content and people are still relying on this content. So I think that's this idea that yes, we produce it for TV, but the comedy shows that are successful are the ones that are gonna also repackage it more and more in these shorter bits, right? And so even if you're not watching the show, these little bits are what's getting people's attention and informing them. And so I've done this whole like, kind of overview analysis of comedy and what it needs to do to save democracy while on sabbatical. The other thing I've done is looked particularly at how young people engage with comedy, because I do teach a political entertainment class every couple of years at Loyola. I'm going to teach it again in the fall, and I did have one student the last time like, but I just don't watch television. So like, why are we talking about this stuff? And I was like, I get that you don't watch television, but you know who all these people are, right? You know, and they host other things and award shows, and it's still the stuff that they're putting on television is still the stuff that's being reshared on other platforms. So it still matters. But I think that there are specific ways to further engage young people that comedy kind of needs to do. One, I think, is prioritizing the personal, right? Young people love influencers. So the more that Jimmy Kimmel breaks the fourth wall and talks to you as a person, and a dad instead of a comic, like I think that's gonna continue to engage people. Varying the format, right? Like having all those short YouTube clips and TikTok videos or things that get reshared helps. Capitalize on the pop culture zeitgeist with must-see guest appearances. So one of the things that comedy shows have always done is brought like musicians and different folks who are circulating in pop culture on for interviews. And there was, I don't know if you guys remember, but there was a guy, the gymnast in the Olympics he did like maybe the pommel horse, and he wore the glasses. Like he was like the nerdiest looking gymnast, and he was like the guy for like a week. Yeah. Yes, and he was on with Jimmy Fallon, right? So people watch just for that. So like drawing people in other ways, then they will kind of maybe watch more of the broadcast and learn more of what's going on in our world. Cross-pollinate and connect with other comics. They've all done like specials together for climate change and other issues. Like you might be a Jimmy Kimmel person, but if he does a special with all these other people, you then are exposed to all these other comedians, right? And so bringing you together for like other purposes like expands the impact of comedy. Diversify the writer's room and uplift new comic voices. Like we need to move away from those 5 guys who all like they could be someone's dad, right? Treat politics seriously, but also entertain. People still come to comedy for the laughs. The politics is secondary. And then engage the audience online and in political action. So these are all the things I've been kind of like doing. I do want to get your suggestions for what you think comedy needs to do to save democracy, but I also wanted to mention, so we'll come back to it because I want to mention my work on public engagement with science, because I know you guys are all like in various science departments. So I taught a Hopkins class this past winter for like all these undergraduates in neuroscience and all these other departments who were like, we're so glad to talk about humor for 2 weeks and not science. But comedy has also been used, in humor in particular, to help people engage with science. And one of the things that's really cool about this work is I've done it with folks from UW-Madison. So this is we all presented together at AAAS in Denver in 2024. And we were looking at how humor could engage people. We looked at cartoons, social media posts, all this kind of stuff to talk about the use of humor in engaging science. And so the folks in the photo, Mike Cacciatore graduated maybe like a year or 2 after me. He does not ski, so he is just the floating head. But we actually so it was in Denver. That's Ashley Anderson in the green, Sarah Yao in the red. We've all known each other since we were here. And we didn't actually Sarah and I might not have been here at the same time. We've never really figured this out, but we all work together on all this stuff. And I get to bring my expertise in comedy. They bring their science communication work. We've done all this stuff that, humor is a really effective tool for science communication. And so we've looked at it across a range of different things. So Ashley and I looked at one-sided versus two-sided humor. It turns out people, when we're talking about a science issue like climate change, want something that has a point of view, right? And so we find that one-sided satirical humor is better than something that kind of jokes around a scientific issue, both in terms of message engagement and actually getting people to activate and engage on the climate issue. We found that the 4 of us worked together. We did a really simple experiment. We looked at how audience laughter, if you watch a sitcom, it has that laugh track. I know no one watches television, but there's a laugh track, versus when you take that away. And so hearing other people laugh when it comes to science-related humor, in this case it was science stand-up, makes people think that the person telling the jokes is more credible, regardless of whether they're labeled as a scientist or a comic, and it makes them more likely to engage in science participation. So just that audience reinforcement piece. And then we looked at what happens when you change the race. So we had an African-American scientist and a white scientist, the gender, male and female, and also job titles, so we called them either scientist or comedian, how that changes how you perceive the value of that humor and engage with science. And it turns out it matters most that you're funny, not that you are a particular race or particular gender or titled in a certain way. And so making people laugh increases the effectiveness of the communicator and also people's willingness to engage and share. And so we've actually, over the years, these are just some of the publications that we've done, but we've had this series of works that really look at how humor can shape public engagement with science, and it all kind of started from We all knew each other from here, and we're all really interested in this stuff, and we all bring different things, and it's like my favorite. We actually need to do some more stuff, but it's my favorite like collaboration, and it all was because we all in some way like passed through LSC. That's me. I do want to ask you your suggestions to save, how humor can save democracy. And it's okay if you don't watch TV. But like, there's things that I'm missing in this work, but it was time for me to take a step back and say, like, we're not having that debate anymore really about whether it's like, saving democracy or, Jon Stewart's the sinner. Like, it's having some sort of positive impact, but can it still have a positive impact given how much we don't all watch the same stuff and talk to each other, and nobody's watching legacy like broadcast television anymore?